I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler. Coming up on Football Today.
Celebrated football superstar who divides opinion for his on-field performances and off-field comments. The name is Mesut Ozil, and his latest target is China.
The US Secretary of State has come out in support of Arsenal football star Mesut Ozil after he criticised China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims. Mike Pompeo says while Beijing can censor the club's football matches, it cannot hide human rights violations.
With one singular Instagram post, Arsenal midfielder Mesut Ozil simultaneously sent off alarm bells from Arsenal headquarters in London to the Chinese government in Beijing last week, sparking interest from around the world. Today, we look at that post and ask, why is Beijing so upset, and what will the fallout be for Arsenal, the Premier League, and football fans in China?
So the Uyghur Muslims are an ethnic minority in Xinjiang, which is a territory in the northwest, kind of far northwest.
Lily Kuo is the Beijing bureau chief for The Guardian.
It's a very vast territory. And so you've got the Uyghurs that are there. You also have ethnic Kazakhs. You also have Hui Chinese. So these are all minorities that are out in Xinjiang. And the situation that they're facing now is that since 2016, there's been this very severe crackdown in the name of countering terrorism. And this crackdown has meant the detention of up to 1.5 million people in these internment camps where they usually undergo political indoctrination. So that means they learn Chinese, they have to learn the kind of tenets of Chinese law and the Communist Party doctrine, and they have to recite patriotic songs and sayings. And
as seen in the only video that exists of a camp under construction, the entrance has an iron gate, the windows have bars, and the cells look like jails. Muhammad says what the Chinese call schools for re-education are actually prisons for brainwashing.
And China has tried to say that these are not internment camps or re-education centers, but they're vocational training centers that people go to voluntarily. But there's been increasingly more evidence that's come out that they're not voluntary and that they're not just kind of like these summer vocational camps that the state describes them as.
Mesut Ozil, obviously this week, came out to talk about the Uyghur Muslims. What did he say?
So he says on his Instagram profile, in China, Qurans are burned, mosques were closed down, Islamic schools, madrasas have been banned, religious scholars killed one by one. Despite all this, Muslims stay quiet.
He also alleges that the ethnic Uyghur Muslims there, well, he says they are warriors resisting persecution from China.
Basically, over the weekend, Arsenal released a statement trying to distance themselves from it.
Arsenal went into damage control. It posted a statement on Chinese social media platform Weibo, insisting that Ozil's remarks reflected his own personal opinion and that the club adheres to the principle of not being involved in politics.
And then Ozil's statement was translated into Chinese, and it did make the rounds online on Chinese social media before it started to get censored. So right now, you can't really see what he said. But it's interesting because, in the Chinese internet, people always find ways to send information around. So right now, even though state media is not reporting what he said, people are still posting pictures of a translation of what he said, and some people are posting the picture upside down so that it won't get censored.
So people, to get around kind of the state, they will send these translations upside down and the state can't read it or find it that way?
It's something like that. But the basic chronology is that he posted this statement online. It got translated into Chinese, and the comments were going around for a while. And so, of course, Chinese internet users reacted very angrily. They were posting on his Instagram page. They were posting on Arsenal's official page on Weibo. They were posting on his official Weibo page because he also has more than 4 million followers on Weibo, on the microblog. And Arsenal only has 5 million, so he has almost the same amount as the team. And, people were just posting all these comments like, how could you say this? You're a footballer, you just need to stick to that. Don't get into politics. And, just a lot of really kind of angry nationalism coming out.
I think he should stick to his job and refrain from making any comments that incite anger in other nations.
No matter how much we used to like him for his excellent sporting skills, we have to take a stand to defend our sovereignty, and we cannot tolerate positions that oppose ours.
But then what became interesting is that the translations of his comments started to get censored. So then you have comments of people saying, like, what did he say exactly? Like, what's going on?
So many of these fans are negatively reacting to the story. And what does the Chinese government do besides censor it?
So they played against Manchester City, and CCTV, the state broadcaster, canceled the live broadcasts of that. And after they canceled that, then other sports streaming sites also said that they would start not showing Arsenal games anymore. But so aside from that, so it's not clear now what's going to happen. So if it will be the rest of the season or if it will just be a few months, that the state broadcaster and then other sports streaming sites will follow in their footsteps, whether or not they'll all kind of have this ban on Arsenal for a while. The other response from the Chinese government was the spokesperson for the foreign ministry said that Ozil had been deceived or that he'd been misled by fake news, basically. And he invited him to come to Xinjiang to have a look for himself. So it's interesting their response to this case versus their response to the NBA case over the Rockets general manager's comments about Hong Kong, because China went very hard in response to that. And this time it seems like they don't want it to escalate quite as much. So you can tell from the state response, and then also state media hasn't been going. I mean, so there were a lot of editorials criticizing Ozil kind of early in the week, but they're not kind of drumming up the anger, or they're not trying to make it bigger, it seems.
Is that because they don't want more people talking about it and talking about what's going on there?
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of like the Barbra Streisand effect. Is that right? Like is that the nose? If you get a nose job, then it draws more attention to your nose or something.
It sounds about right.
And I think that they maybe realized that in the case of Hong Kong, that it might have actually done more damage than was intended. So that, they stood up to the NBA, but then it became such a big thing, and you had people going to NBA games with signs about Hong Kong. So it kind of gave the protest movement another platform. And even last weekend, after Ozil made his comments, there was a demonstration I think in Turkey, and people were holding up signs with his picture on there. And if it gets bigger, then they just they give more voice to the issues.
I'm joined by Simon Chadwick, Professor of Sports Enterprise at the University of Salford. Simon, before we can discuss Arsenal's relationship with China, we need to discuss a situation that happened earlier this year with China and the NBA. Can you give a quick recap of what happened there?
An official from an NBA franchise, Daryl Morey from Houston, posted on social media his support for protesters in Hong Kong. As a consequence of this, there was a reaction both from the Chinese government, but also from Chinese public and Chinese basketball fans, as well as from broadcasters and commercial partners in China to this tweet. Inevitably, this not only drew a response from the Houston franchise itself, but also from the NBA and from the NBA Commissioner Adam Silver. And as somebody who's just recently returned from China, I think it's important to point out that the ramifications of this tweet are still ongoing. I was talking to several people from the Chinese sport industry last week about the fallout from the whole episode, and that is still ongoing. There are still issues around numbers of people watching NBA games, issues around the renegotiation of commercial contracts.
The corporate backlash has also been comprehensive. Tencent Sports quickly announced that it would cease streaming the Rockets games. Li Ning, a sportswear company, declared that it would suspend its selling of the team's merchandise. And the Shanghai Pudong Development Bank, a team sponsor, followed suit by suspending their relationship.
And there is still some resistance amongst Chinese social media users and basketball fans towards the incident too.
This is all based on one tweet where he is standing up for protesters in Hong Kong. That's it, right?
Effectively, yes. All it takes is one small comment but this is the door to a room that within which there is a very complex environment. So it may only be a small number of characters or one sentence, but what that then does is it opens up a portal to all kinds of issues, and it places the likes of the NBA in a challenging position, which the likes of the NBA, and obviously in the case of Mesut Ozil and Arsenal, requires these organisations to take a position. And getting that position right from their perspective is a major challenge. And just as we've seen the NBA incident spiral out of control, we're now seeing the Mesut Ozil incident beginning to grow. And the consequences, the ramifications tend not to be over in a day or two. They tend to ripple out over weeks and possibly months in some cases.
What are the stakes for this? How many millions are on the line?
Well, it's very difficult to know. But obviously what we need to keep in mind is that China is, by population, is certainly at the moment the biggest country in the world. The country's economy is still growing, if not as healthily as, say, a decade ago, is certainly still very strong. And so in terms of revenue streams, this is one of the world's biggest markets for sport right now. And what we have therefore seen is the likes of the NBA and European soccer teams seeing China as a potentially lucrative source of business. But I think essentially, as I say, this is about Western sports organisations with an eye for business, keenly pursuing lucrative revenue streams, choosing to operate in an environment that is complex, that is highly political, and I think in some ways is an asymmetric relationship. The power is definitely in the hands of China right now, certainly when it comes to individual sports franchises or even for that matter, individual sports.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that they have the leverage. Right now, the Premier League is in the middle of a 3-year contract worth $700 million. And not only that, Arsenal has been in the Chinese market for years. So what sort of consequences could this mean for Arsenal, the club?
We need to know what the life of the Mesut Ozil incident is. We've seen what the life of the Moria incident is. We know that there has been a fan backlash. We know that there's been a public backlash. But equally, we know too that some basketball fans believe that their sport and their franchise and their favourite stars transcend whatever politics can throw at them. So I think in the case of Arsenal, it's very early stages. We don't know whether this is going to rumble on for months and years or whether it's a relatively short-term issue.
So it seems like China just wants every sports personality in the world to kind of never comment on anything that's going on in China. And if any sports personality does, it looks like it's kind of modus operandi is just to not broadcast any of their games. Is that their strategy, or am I misinterpreting this?
With respect, I think you're oversimplifying it. This is not just an issue for sport. I think it's an issue for any organisation that seeks to do business in China. They will be subject to the same controls, the same monitoring, the same scrutiny. So what I would say to sport is it's nothing personal. This is happening to people in the engineering sector, in the IT sector, in automotive, in aerospace.
Take airlines. All the major US carriers have gotten flack for listing Taiwan as a separate country on their drop-down menus. So did Marriott Hotels for listing Taiwan and Tibet. Mercedes-Benz was disciplined for quoting the Dalai Lama on an Instagram post.
Yeah, no, we don't want to go there. Talking about the Dalai Lama doesn't go over well with the Chinese.
My personal view is we're in the middle of an ideological battle. We're in the middle of an ideological battle between Western liberalism and Eastern authoritarianism. And if you want to speak out freely on any issue that you choose to, whether it's what's happening in the west of China or anywhere else in the world for that matter, and also do business in China, you need to be aware there will be consequences of that. My point is, as you can see, there is this territorial battle taking place between Western and Eastern ideologies. And I do think increasingly the power balance in that battle is tipping towards China. And as we've seen, the outcome of this is that in the NBA case, in the Arsenal case, because they see China as a potentially lucrative source of revenue, both the NBA and Arsenal have rapidly tried to find a position whereby they protect their commercial interests in China without necessarily undermining a broader moral position that they might have outside China. But that's a difficult balance to achieve. I'm always reminded of George W. Bush's War on Terror quote when he said, "You're either with us or you're against us." And certainly when it comes to operating in China, what any sports organization needs to keep in mind is that at some stage the Chinese government may effectively say to the NBA, to Arsenal, to anyone else, "You're either with us or you're against us."
So if you were consulting, let's just say you were consulting Liverpool and you were concerned that Mohamed Salah was going to make a public statement standing by the Uyghur Muslims, what would you be advising Liverpool to do?
I think the first observation that I would make, and this is a really important contextual observation, is that China has a very long and much more complex relationship with Islam than many people realise. So it's very common to go to a Chinese city and for there to be an Islamic quarter, for there to be mosques and for there to be Muslim restaurants, Muslim cafes. You will see sometimes Muslims in the street. So I think what China needs to do is to explain to the world what its relationship with Islam is. But I think the world also needs to understand too that China has a long relationship with Islam that people need to find out about. Now, I'm not condoning violence against anyone. I don't condone the suppression of any human beings anywhere in the world, and I think it's important to stress that. But essentially what any football club is doing by seeking to, for example, go to China, is you're making a judgment call. And that judgment call is that you effectively are ceding control of your communications to the Chinese state. A lot of these clubs, when faced with a choice between upholding a set of principles or chasing the money, have decided to chase the money. And I certainly what we've seen in the case of Arsenal is, I think the public statement that they put out was never going to be sufficient. Because I think in this issue, there is no middle ground. I use the phrase again, you're either with China or you're against China. You can't sit in the middle. And what Arsenal has tried to do is to sit in the middle.
So Lily, how much do people in China know about the situation with the Uyghur Muslims?
Xinjiang is kind of this red line, so there's absolutely there's no media in China that will report on the situation there and say, yes, there are these human rights abuses, yes, there are these people being detained, yes, people are being surveilled and having officials come live with them in their homes so they can keep an eye on them, or mosques are being torn down, and there's just domestic media doesn't cover that because it's probably the most sensitive thing for the Chinese government right now. In terms of how much people know about it, it's hard to say because there's always a portion of the population that kind of jumps the Great Firewall and they read foreign media. But I would say that most people, at this point, they might know that there's a lot of criticism about what's happening in Xinjiang from Western countries and Western media. But I would say that they believe the government's stance on it, which is that we're helping develop this region. Terrorism was very bad in China. China did have several very bad terrorist attacks that authorities say were linked to Xinjiang separatists.
Among some of the worst incidents, the 1997 Yining terror attack, which left 7 dead and 198 wounded. The 2009 Urumqi riots, which left 197 dead and over 1,700 wounded.
And so I think Chinese people remember those very violent attacks. And so if the government is saying, we're doing this for your safety, and Western media and all these Western officials, they just want to slander China, they just want to make China look bad. So Chinese people mostly believe what's being reported in their media.
It almost feels like the issues that Chinese fans are having with Ozil are not necessarily what he said, but just the fact that he's attacking the Chinese government.
Today I went to a store that sells Manchester United stuff. They sell NBA stuff. So I went to the area where they were selling the Arsenal stuff. And I asked a guy that was looking through the clothes what he thought about what was going on. And he said, I've been to Xinjiang. It's great. It's a great place. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So I think it's a combination of people saying, who is this guy? He doesn't know what's going on in China. We live here. So, some of us have been to Xinjiang and it's fine and it's peaceful now and it wasn't peaceful before. And also the fact that he's criticizing China. There is a very strong sentiment that you can't criticize China and China is a strong country and we have to defend our country.
How would these Arsenal fans feel if they weren't able to watch any of their Arsenal matches again in the future in the country?
The guy I talked to in the store, he's actually not an Arsenal fan, but he said that it's something that football fans worry about because obviously it's not just, it's whoever Arsenal's playing who also, that their match also gets blocked. And if these matches get blocked, then they'll have to resort to just reading about what happened. And I talked to a guy who runs a sports media company here, and he was saying that, the games are really important. I mean, the matches are really important for fans to stay connected to the team. And Arsenal's been, investing. It's one of the first football clubs to have entered the Chinese market and I think they first played here in 1995. So, they've been here for a long time. And, if people can't watch those matches, then it really cuts off that point of connection. But also there's diehard fans and they will find a way anyway. They might get VPNs and subscribe to streaming services that are hosted outside of China. So this guy that I talked to, he's kind of a secret Rockets fan. And so ever since the Rockets have been kind of banned here, all those fans have had to go underground and figure out ways to watch the games. And I was asking why they didn't criticize what happened and the government's moves to block the games as, kind of too overboard. And he was saying that if you say stuff like that, you get shouted down. You get shouted down by all those nationalist voices who a lot of them are younger people. And they're saying, you don't love your country and the country's more important than your sports team.
How worried do you think China is by this Ozil story?
So when they responded so strongly to Daryl Morey's comments, it kind of showed how sensitive they were, right? And how worried they were about the protests in Hong Kong and what people thought about them. And so I think that they're smart this time to not respond so strongly to this because it doesn't betray that they're worried, that they're so worried about what people will say about Xinjiang or what people think about it. I think right now they're trying to show that they are so confident with what they're doing there that they know what the truth is and they don't, it doesn't matter what other people say. But I think you can see in the censorship of the topic, you can see in the blocking of the games that they are worried about it.
You mentioned that people are still seeing the image and that it's still going around a bit. Is there any chance that this has actually created some awareness to people in China, specifically maybe sports fans that didn't even know that this was really happening, or maybe are now questioning what the government's actually doing in that region?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it like that. These sports fans, and it's probably the same with the NBA too. All these guys, they weren't thinking about the Hong Kong protests, and then suddenly they have to start thinking about it. And it's the same with Xinjiang, is that, they weren't paying attention to the fights between the Chinese government and foreign media over what's happening, where the Chinese government's always criticizing foreign media for and trying to say that foreign media reports about what's happening there is fake news. So yeah, now they are confronted with that. So the question of whether it's raising awareness, I guess any time it comes up, then it is coming to the public view. And so you have this voice coming up from the outside saying, oh, but this is what's happening. And even if most people still believe the Chinese government narrative, it does kind of plant that little seed of, oh, there are people outside that say that it is really bad.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to kind of look at this in the big picture, what does this say about Chinese people or the Chinese government?
I think on the one hand, it does show the government's sensitivity to criticism. And as much as the Chinese government says that they don't care what critics say and that they're confident with their path of development and their political system, I think this shows that they do care, because they responded very quickly to what a footballer who was in the UK said on his Instagram post. When you think about it like that, it is a little bit extreme. And then I think in terms of the response from the public, it also shows how strong this nationalist sentiment, this patriotic sentiment that... So somebody I spoke to today, he's in his 30s. And so he was saying that his generation and his parents, when they were growing up, in the 80s and 90s, China was still developing. And to them, they still thought of China as a developing country. And even his parents, I think of China as, they might still think of China as a poor country. But the generation now, these guys born in the 1990s and the 2000s, one, they grew up with a lot of patriotic education. So that's in their school system, it's even more pronounced that you should love your country and that you need to defend your country. And that's really important. And then they also have grown up in a much stronger China that is a much bigger power economically and also in international relations. And so for them, if somebody says something bad about China, then they can respond and say, like, you can't do that. You need to respect us. And so I think that's what we're seeing here.
You can read Lily Kuo's coverage of China and the situation facing Uyghur Muslims in The Guardian. Simon Chadwick is a professor at the University of Salford, and you can follow his coverage of sports, business, and politics in Eurasia on Twitter. The show is produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and this was Football Today. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on iTunes and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.